Moses was not allowed to enter the promised land because of an incident at Meribah. This moment is more than just a historical record. It's a story that resonates with timeless lessons about obedience, humility, and the nature of spiritual leadership. Moses had led the Israelites for years, carrying the heavy burden of guiding a nation through the desert, from slavery toward freedom. He served as their leader, prophet, and intercessor, often standing before God on behalf of his people. His relationship with God was marked by a profound sense of calling and dedication. He was the one who, through God's power, performed miracles in Egypt, challenged Pharaoh, and guided the people safely across the Red Sea. Moses' journey was filled with remarkable faith and resilience. Yet as the people approached the Promised Land, after decades of wandering and waiting, Moses faced one of the most significant challenges of his leadership, a test of patience and trust that would ultimately prevent him from entering the land he had spent a lifetime leading his people toward. At Meribah, the people of Israel were once again without water. Frustrated and weary, they began to complain. They questioned Moses' leadership, and more importantly, they questioned God's provision. For Moses, this scene was all too familiar. He had encountered the people's complaints time and again. Each time they faced a trial, they seemed to forget all that God had done for them, the miracles, the provisions, the victories. Each time, Moses had responded by interceding, by trusting God's guidance, and by encouraging the people to remember God's faithfulness. But this time, the situation was different. God's instructions to Moses were clear and specific. He told Moses to speak to a rock, and water would flow out for the people to drink. This command was simple yet profound. It required an act of faith, a display of complete trust in God's power and presence. But Moses, perhaps overwhelmed by the constant complaints, by the weight of his responsibilities, acted out of frustration. Instead of speaking to the rock, as God had commanded, he struck it twice with his staff. And as he did so, he said to the people, "Must we bring you water out of this rock?" In this one statement, Moses implied that he and Aaron, not God alone, were the ones responsible for providing water. This subtle shift in language revealed a deeper issue in Moses' heart. His frustration, his weariness, his impatience had led him to act as if the burden of the people's needs rested on his shoulders rather than God's. This act of striking the rock was more than a small mistake. It was a significant act of disobedience that carried deep meaning. God's command to speak to the rock required faith and humility. By choosing to strike the rock instead, Moses showed a momentary lapse in trust, acting from his own understanding and his own frustrations. In that moment, he acted as though he could take control, as if he could resolve the situation on his own terms, rather than relying on God's word. This moment revealed Moses' humanity, his frustration, his fatigue, his vulnerability as a leader who had been bearing the people's burdens for so long. For someone in Moses' position, this disobedience carried serious consequences. God had chosen Moses to be the leader of his people, a representative of his authority, his compassion, and his character. Moses' actions were more than personal choices. They were a model for the entire nation of Israel. When Moses faltered, it had implications for how the people saw God, for their understanding of his nature, and for their trust in his provision. Moses' act at Meribah disrupted the image of God's direct provision, replacing it with a display of human frustration and control. God's response to Moses was direct and revealing. Because of his disobedience, God declared that Moses would not lead the people into the Promised Land. Instead, he would only see it from a distance. This decision might seem severe, but it underscores the seriousness with which God views obedience, especially from those in positions of leadership. Moses' actions at Meribah serve as a reminder that spiritual leadership is a weighty responsibility, one that demands humility, trust, and obedience. As the leader of God's people, Moses was called to reflect God's will with complete faithfulness, to guide the people in trusting God rather than relying on human strength. The incident at Meribah also offers a powerful reflection on the challenges of leadership. Even the most faithful leaders, like Moses, face moments of frustration, doubt, and weariness. The weight of responsibility, the constant pressures, the unending demands can make even the strongest among us feel vulnerable. Moses' actions at Meribah remind us that even resilient leaders must guard against allowing their personal emotions to interfere with their obedience to God's instructions. His story shows us the importance of humility and patience, especially for those called to lead others in faith. This story also illuminates something essential about the nature of God's justice and grace. God's decision to bar Moses from entering the Promised Land highlights his justice. Moses' disobedience had consequences. God's instructions were clear, and Moses had failed to follow them. Yet even in this, we see God's grace. Although Moses was denied entry into the Promised Land, God did not abandon him. God allowed him to see the land from a distance, granting Moses a glimpse of the future he had worked so tirelessly toward. This act was a gesture of compassion, showing Moses that his journey, his sacrifices, and his dedication were not in vain. Reflecting on Moses' life, we see that his legacy is not defined by this one failure. Instead, Moses' life remains a testament to faith, courage, and resilience. He was the one who stood before Pharaoh and demanded freedom for his people. He was the one who led the Israelites out of Egypt, the one who received the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, the one who guided a generation through the wilderness. His relationship with God was marked by deep intimacy, reverence, and friendship. Despite his failure at Meribah, Moses' legacy endures as one of the greatest examples of leadership and faith in the story of God's people. Moses' story challenges us to examine our own lives, to consider how we respond to God's guidance, especially in moments of difficulty and frustration. It reminds us that even those who walk closely with God can experience moments of doubt, moments where our own emotions threaten to overshadow our faith. Moses' story reminds us that no one is beyond the need for humility, obedience, and reliance on God's wisdom. Yet it also shows us that God's grace remains steadfast, that He does not define us solely by our failures, but by our willingness to keep seeking Him. In conclusion, the story of Moses at Meribah is a profound lesson in obedience, humility, and the responsibilities of spiritual leadership. It teaches us that our actions have consequences, that God values humility and trust, and that our relationship with Him requires an ongoing commitment to faith and obedience. Moses' legacy is not one of failure, but of faith, perseverance, and an enduring pursuit of God's presence. May Moses' story inspire us to walk faithfully in our own lives, to trust in God's wisdom, to seek His guidance with humility, and to rely on His strength in moments of weakness. And may we remember that even in our moments of weakness, God's grace remains. Like Moses, we are all on a journey with God, a journey marked by both triumphs and challenges, always guided by His love. Moses' story reminds us of the beauty of a life lived in service to God, the hope in His mercy and grace, and the call to remain faithful, trusting in His perfect plan. As we continue to reflect on Moses' story, may we strive to follow his example of dedication, to seek God with our whole hearts, and to remember that ultimately, God's grace is greater than any human failure. Moses' life shows us that, while we are called to uphold God's standards, our relationship with Him is built on grace, forgiveness, and growth.